Drilling is pointless, or at least that's what some of the coaches are talking about inside of academia, inside of their practice, and also on YouTube. There was a video about jiu-jitsu talking about a gym that says drilling is pointless. But if you scroll through some of the comments, there are people saying, oh, well, instead of drilling, you're doing situational games or positional games or just games in general. There's nothing different there. However, what this coach, Greg Souders, said is, no, it is different. It's the ecological approach, which recently, in Christmas in 2024, there was a paper that came out that critiqued the ecological approach and asked a very important question. How does it, I assume the ecological approach, work? Ecological coaches say you can't pick and mix approaches, and the ecological approach isn't just games. It's not games for understanding. It's not the same as situational sparring or positional sparring, and this is what I want to discuss in this video. The critique paper says ecological dynamics alone appears insufficient to guide practice, which isn't necessarily directed at games or at drilling, but it's certainly part of the conversation, and as someone that uses the ecological dynamics framework to rationalize the way that I practice, I feel I have some thoughts on this that might be useful for the authors of the paper and to keep this conversation going. And there are 4 main points I want to bring up. But as a couple of quick caveats before I get started, the paper, the critique paper, was an opinion paper. And it was also mentioned towards the end of the paper that they are presuming explanations, so my guess is that they are guessing a little bit as to the way the ecological approach, or ecological dynamics, ecological psychology, could be applied in practice, and that is where I feel my voice may be able to help. So, drilling. When it comes to drills, or practice, or play, or fun, or whatever word you want to put to human behaviour in sport or any other learning environments, I feel like semantics plays a huge role here. The saying that I personally use when I'm discussing this is, meanings are in people, not words. You can see the symbols, the letters of the word, but the meaning, what that word means to you, will be different to what it means to someone else. A drill to one coach may mean something completely different to a drill to another coach. A drill for me, and I assume is what Greg Souders, the person in the video at the beginning, mentioned, drills highly constrained environments, highly constrained sessions or practice design with very little room for exploration of potential solutions to the problems set, i.e. kick ball against wall, there's not much variability there, it's just the wall and yourself. You add some complexity, so another person, now it's much harder to do. And so the comment about drills being pointless, I feel, is directed at the highly constrained, highly simplified practice sessions or practice design where there isn't much variability, there isn't much complexity, and it doesn't represent the whole activity, the whole game, the whole sport, the whole problem that people are likely to face in the, quote, real world. So instead of looking at drills or the practice design, I would look at the behaviours of the individuals involved in the session, but also the behaviours of the coaches and the educators. Maybe you do a session and the practice looks exactly the same, but the way that you progress forwards, the things that you do next, might be different because of the reasons behind the practice. For an example, from my sport in trampoline, you could ask someone to land on their bum and get back to their feet. That could be described as a drill or a challenge. What you do after that will change depending on the reasons why you've set that challenge. Do I want them to compete in a competition? Maybe I do, maybe I don't. And the philosophy of the coach may be, okay, now you need to drill the right way to do the seat landing in the competition. Legs straight, knees to the sky, toes pointed, etc. Biomechanical instructions. The coach may give those instructions. That coaching philosophy is different from the ecological approach, whereas for me, if there was someone that wanted to go to competition and do a seat landing, i.e. land on their bum and get back to their feet, I wouldn't tell them the right way to do it, or give them direct biomechanical instructions. I would ask them, well, can you do it with straight legs? Can you do it with bent legs? Can you do it in different ways to explore what is easier for them? And as they develop the skills, the representation of that skill in the measured context, in this case a competition, would be similar. But if they're not going to compete, it doesn't need to be this perfect, ideal movement for competition if they just want to land on their bum and face the other way, or land on their bum and go somewhere else. Which makes me think about when you learn to drive. Is the instructor teaching you to pass the driving test, or teach you to drive on the road with various changes? I know a lot of people in the driving industry are arguing about some of the instructors teaching people to pass the test. Then once they've got their license, they've passed the test, they then make mistakes in the first couple of years because they're not familiar with different roads, with how to navigate different problems. And that comes back to the reasons why the drills, the practice, the games, the whatever it is that you're doing in the design is put in place. Moving on to the next point about discounting certain elements of learning, I'm going to quote the paper. They say, discounted concepts such as internal representations and knowledge as critical for movement control. The internal representations relating to direct and indirect perception, which I discussed in the long video about ecological psychology, but during that video I believe I also talk about knowledge of and knowledge about, which you can explain how to do something, a movement, or you can show how to do a movement. Knowledge of, knowledge about, different types of knowledge, which is discussed a lot in ecological dynamics. So I don't feel it's discounted or not discussed. If anything, it's discussed a lot because of the reasons why we make the practice design. The practice design focused on the doing of the skill, not focusing on them answering questions about the skill. A recent example of this from my own coaching is I'm working with an individual that has been coached by someone else, and they are very good at explaining the biomechanics of what a skill should look like. But when it comes to doing the skill, they're very poor at recognizing what part of that explanation is applicable to what they've just done. They're great at answering the question, but they're not so good at relating the question to what they've just done. Knowledge of, knowledge about, very different. And this directly relates to education of attention and education of intention. Us creating a practice design for them to educate their attention to information that is useful. If it's a highly constrained drill and there's not much complexity, they don't really need to train or practice or learn where to pay attention because there's only a few things to pay attention to. You add complexity and they haven't been educated about where to pay attention, they then may struggle. Same with the intention. Do they know what the intention of the behaviour is in this context? Now we've added some complexity. And I could discuss this at length, but I'm not going to for the sake of the length of this YouTube video. But to briefly mention the internal representations remark, I feel like this is an interesting conversation for the academics specifically, because internal representation may mean something different to those in active inference research, or those that are heavily maybe radical and activists or ecological psychologists. And even within each of those fields in cognitive science, representation and internal both have different meanings. Going back to that semantics that I mentioned at the start, meanings are in people, not words. So saying that we're not, we as in ecological psychologists or those following or using ecological dynamics as a framework are not in using internal representations will depend on what it is specifically you're talking about. If you're referring to the internal representation thing, copy of the world in our head, no, because direct perception. But again, mentioned that previously. And I feel these fields in cognitive science also relate to the comments around mental imagery and planning and other timescale or time frame specific concepts. I know Rob Gray did a podcast episode, I think 3 years ago now, talking about online and offline information, but Carl Friston in the active inference and free energy principle research talks about time scales, then other people talk about time frames, some people talk about fractal analysis. They're all different terms to discuss the same idea in that sometimes when you measure, well, most of the time when you measure, you have a start point and an end point. In ecological psychology, we believe that there is non-linear, non-obvious causality. So as soon as you pick a start point, you could have removed some of the causes that happened before. And the end point, again, something else that is continuing, because we believe that we are organisms that are continually adjusting to the world, which some people use that as an executive... What's that? I think Carl Friston and those inside the active inference calls this a generative model, the ongoing generative model, which once you've picked points, it's inaccurate because now it's not within the world. In ecological psychology, it's somewhat similar in that there is ongoing perception and action, which is why we are cognizing in the world, part of the subtitle of the Introduction to Ecological Psychology textbook, which obviously the previous video was based on, if you've watched it. So different testing methods leads to often different words and different concepts. So as Andrew Wilson recently tweeted, I guess on Blue Sky, there's a ton of cog-neuro results that eco-neuro just doesn't need to engage with for perfectly legitimate reasons. Which brings me on to cognition, and again I'm going to quote them from the paper, nor sufficiently explains key constructs such as cognition and intention. But sufficiently explaining cognition to me seems very difficult, especially considering those in cognitive science, when we look at the mark of the cognitive, the different marks that we define as this is cognition, it isn't agreed upon. There is no definition, there is no sufficient explanation. When I think about the 4 E's, embedded, embodied, enacted, and extended cognition, I believe there's an A in there as well, and potentially another E. If people inside of cognitive science can't agree on what cognition is, I'm not sure why there is a critique about sufficiently explaining what cognition is. But even saying that, when I think about the subtitle of the Introduction to Ecological Psychology textbook, they use cognizing. Because in ecological psychology, we are continually cognizing, or perceiving our experiences as living organisms, and that is how we would describe what cognition is. Andrew Wilson wrote a blog post, I think like a decade ago now, about verbing your nouns. Instead of cognition, it's cognizing. We're verbing things. Instead of memory, it's remembering. Instead of action, it's acting. So we are constantly doing things, it's processes. Now I recognise that sounds somewhat semantical, you're verbing a noun, but the meaning behind those words, for me at least, certainly changes. Instead of talking about a discrete situation of that was cognition, I'm now discussing the processes that could be happening throughout, before and after the picked measure that I'm using, which means that other things, non-obvious, non-linear causality, could be part of the behaviours that I'm looking at when I'm coaching. Instead of the coaching session starting at 4 o'clock when I start the session, it actually started maybe at the beginning of the day when they woke up and they had energy and now they've lost energy. Maybe it's the week because of the load, thinking about periodization in strength and conditioning training, or any of the other sports sciences we're talking about. There are multiple timescales to consider when I think about cognition or cognizing throughout our experiences. Hopefully that makes sense and I'm not rambling too much. And in a similar way, because we are cognizing through, we are doing things, we are behaving, we are acting, there is always, because organisms have a purpose, there is a reason, there is a point, there is an intention to behaviour. We are goal-directed organisms. Most organisms are goal-directed, actions being focused on, oftentimes, survival. But of course, when we're talking about sports coaching or skill development in any area or aspect, there are behaviours that have intentions. What is the point of this? That is how practice design is designed. We look at the intentions and attentions of the individuals involved, education of attention and intention. So I would say intention is certainly discussed in ecological dynamics and ecological psychology because it builds up the framework and the fundamental assumptions on how organisms, humans, behave. Which brings me full circle. Some of the points saying that the ecological approach is just old wine in new bottles. Drilling is pointless is something that's been addressed and tackled by Games for Understanding, and it's just situational games or situational sparring or positional sparring. There's nothing new there. And at a shallow level of analysis, this is pretty accurate because everyone uses constraints. We all use constraints, and so the constraints-led approach to coaching isn't anything new. However, the reasons behind using the constraints are new, and that is where the constraints-led approach differs from teaching Games for Understanding. But understanding the reasons why, I feel, requires an understanding of ecological psychology ideas, which most coaches, from my experience, aren't familiar with or don't have an interest in going into, which means they don't go deep enough, potentially, to grasp the reasons, the differences, the philosophy behind it, which I feel is where the confusion lies. So why do you put a constraint in place? What's the reason? Well, to change the difficulty, to make it easier or harder. Easy, simple. But what constraints, what change do you make? That's the difference, I feel. But to give an example from my personal coaching with a front somersault on a trampoline. I could simplify, I could add some constraints, I could simplify the front somersault by stepping on the trampoline. Now, I'm controlling their height because I'm on the trampoline with them. I can help them so they don't have to pay attention to how much force they're putting through the trampoline or anything like that. I can have my hand on their shoulder, hand on their waist, or with a belt, and I can help them round. And I can help round forwards or backwards. It really doesn't matter because I'm there. I'm in control, and it's a simple exercise. It's a simple movement. I've added constraints to simplify the task. But this can result in the individual relying on me as the coach to be there to help with the jumping, to help with the rotation, to help with things, because as soon as I step away, the task has become extremely complex, and now they are less familiar, and it's almost like they are relearning again. They've become familiar with going over their head, because I've helped them with that bit, but doing the somersault movement is foreign to them. And that is why, for me, instead of adding the constraints by me going on and restricting how they move, I add constraints through the practice design. I ask them to do a forwards roll to get familiar going forwards. I ask them to do things lower or at a comfortable height so they get experienced doing somersaults themselves over to the bum, over to back, and then we can build up, we can add complexity, build up, okay, can you get your feet under you? Can you land on your feet? And there is elements of safety, of course, involved, so there's mats and everything else around, but I am not on the trampoline, so it doesn't drastically change the skill, and that is where my reasoning behind the constraints could be different to another coach. But I am going to emphasize there is no right or wrong way to coach. There are effective and ineffective ways to coach, but again, it's going to depend on the relationship between the coach, the athlete, the stakeholders, the parents, and the rest of the coaching environment as to what could be most useful in that specific context. So that's why there's no how it works answer, which I feel was a bit of a tongue-in-cheek question from those authoring the paper? Yeah, I think that's those authoring the paper. And to share some general thoughts around the discussion from cognitive psychology and ecological psychology seeming to be an us versus them, there are certainly different opinions, but there are different opinions within both of those fields as well, some of which agree. So some people on the cognitive side agree with people on the ecological side, so the us versus them I don't feel is as effective as a debate as it could be, and some of the conversations in these debates, these papers, the podcasts and content that's going out doesn't seem to be moving the field forward as much as I would like it to. I tend to agree with what Andrew Wilson posted on Blue Sky about this critique paper. This paper is pretty bad. It cherry picks and is very superficial at key moments. It doesn't engage with the details of the ecological approach, and it willfully misrepresents a few elements to build a narrative of inconsistency and intellectual dishonesty within ECOD, ecological dynamics. I had a longer conversation with another coach about this, which I'll leave a link to in the description below. It's an unlisted, long conversation, but I'm interested to hear your thoughts on drilling, on games, on ecological psychology, and on anything else that I've discussed in this video.